Good morning, all, and welcome to this, our second installment on Zionism, both its history and how it's all playing out today. We are so grateful to have the Reverend Dr. Melanie Duguid-May, who is leading this series for and with us. I am wondering, I know last week we had some people from our partner congregations. Is there anybody here today that is not a third church? Well, there's Mindy Schaefer, so thank you. I'm so glad that you are here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do we have any others that are here from other congregations? Someone online? Okay. Carol and Phil Amon. Am I saying that correctly? So grateful for your presence. Thank you so much for being with us. It is just a blessing to be able to provide this and to spread the word as much as we can about this important issue. And so with that, I'd also like to welcome Melanie and to thank her so much for bringing her expertise to us here. Melanie taught theology and women and gender studies at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School for 32 years. She is now the CRCDS VP for Academic Affairs and the Dean of Faculty. She is a priest at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Bath, which is why she's with us online and not here because she has another job. But we're very grateful that you're making your way to be able to handle us this way. We're grateful. Thank you. Melanie has also been a frequent traveler to Israel, Palestine. She went there the first time in 1975 as a college student, studying both biblical archaeology and the situation of Palestinian Christians. In 2007, she spent a 6-month sabbatical at Tanfor Ecumenical Institute, and in 2 subsequent 1-month stays while researching Jerusalem Testament, Palestinian Christians, which was published in 2010. She also did 5 study pilgrimages to Palestine from 2013 to 2019. So as you can see, there's not just head knowledge, but there's a lot of on-the-ground knowledge that Dr. May brings to us. And I'm grateful for that as well. She is additionally a founding member for Rochester Witness for Palestine. So there's an awful lot there that she brings to this table. We are grateful to be at table together, and let's give a clap offering to God for Dr. May and this time together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here, to be with you, and I'm grateful for your interest and your seeking to understand around a topic so critical to our time. If I could just carry on very briefly from the introduction, the with an autobiographical note. Last week when we talked about Christian Zionism, I noted that it really emerged as a full-blown force politically in the US after the miracle of the 1967 war. This really coincided with my own dawning political consciousness. And I too was caught up in the miracle. I read Leon Uris's Exodus and listened to the stirring musical score to the movie that went with the movie. I read James Michener's The Source, in which the biblical narrative converges and culminates in the establishment of the state of Israel. And I clung to this sense of promise fulfilled even through the tragedy and tumult of the next 8 years, the Tet Offensive, assassinations, the moratorium to end the war, Kent State, the oil embargo, the Yom Kippur War, Watergate. And it was then that I went, as Rebecca has said, in 1975 for the first time to Jerusalem, where I studied for some months, based in Jerusalem on what is called Old Mount Zion, housed in the Holy Land Institute. We were immersed in the dirt and dust of biblical archaeological sites, but also in the political realities of Palestinian life under occupation. That was the spring also that the Lebanese Civil War broke out, which included a horrific impact on the millions of Palestinian refugees living in Beirut and environs. During that time, I also immersed myself in reading the history and ideas of Jewish Zionism. I was captivated by the spirit and the vision that impelled late 19th and early 20th century Zionists. It was a drive for identity, for national self-determination, and for a homeland. Last week, we clarified that the Jewish aspirations, the Jewish Zionist aspirations, were long predated by Christian Zionist aspirations for the restoration of Jews to the promised land. And we briefly traced these aspirations to the popular end time praying for Armageddon. In the early 19th century, interest in a return of the Jews to Palestine was kept alive mostly by Christians, those looking for the second coming of Christ to reign for 1,000 years, that is, those looking for the millennium. The actual term Zionist is said to have been coined by a Jewish student in Vienna, Nathan Birnbaum, in 1892. He wrote a booklet called The National Rebirth of the Jewish People in its Homeland as a means of solving the Jewish problem. His ideas were later taken and elaborated by Theodor Herzl that we talked about last week in his A Jewish State in 1896. And a year later, in 1897, there was the first World Zionist Congress. Most directly, this appearance of Jewish Zionism in late 19th century Europe was a response to conditions created by European colonialism, the ethnic racism and intolerance and anti-Semitism that went with it. In the centuries before this, in the 17th century, the 18th century, there had been Enlightenment teaching about secular toleration of religious difference. And there were accompanying ideas that the Jewish people could be assimilated into European national identity. But those ideas had failed the Jewish people, many of whom had suffered violence as through the 19th century, ethnic nationalism erupted from within multinational empires. One of those ethnic nationalisms was Jewish Zionism. It's also important here to note that many of the early Jewish Zionist leaders really feared assimilation. They feared that if the Jewish people were to be assimilated into European cultures and societies, they would lose their identity. And that was to some much more threatening than anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic pogroms that were perpetrated in Eastern Europe. The earliest leaders of the Jewish Zionist movement were themselves, however, secular and modernist as well as nationalist. From the beginning, however, and this is one of the contradictions built into Jewish nationalism. So on one hand, They're secular, they're modernist, they're ethnic nationalists. On the other hand, they, from the beginning, present Jewish nationalism as an ancient and unchanging idea that expresses 2,000 years of Jewish yearning for a return to the promised land and the establishment of a national home. And it was argued that this is a fulfillment, this Jewish homeland, this Zionist aspiration, a fulfillment of the everlastingness of God's promise of the land to God's chosen people. So I know I talked last week just a bit about Zion, the biblical image of Zion, as referring to Jerusalem, to a little hill in Jerusalem. And I want to say a little bit more about that, particularly because that became so significant to the Jewish understanding of identity, of ethnic identity, of themselves as a people in search of a nation. When the biblical narrative opens with the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham and his descendants are promised the land. And then a second narrative line opens, and that is the enslavement of those descendants in Egypt and their escape that's led by Moses, and the experience that forms them into a people. And that experience happens on another mountain, Mount Sinai. The Jewish people become a people not on Mount Zion, but on Mount Sinai. There's a biblical scholar, his name is John Levinson, who says the Sinai narratives, the Sinai experience disclose the essential normative relationship of God to his people, Israel. The covenant established on Mount Sinai establishes the Jewish people as God's chosen people. From Sinai come the laws, a way of life for God's people. And Levinson also notes that Yahweh's home, Mount Sinai, is not in the land of Israel. It's in the wilderness, a forbidding wasteland. Yahweh is the one of Zion, the one who favors the wilderness away from a settled city or cult. The deity of Sinai says, I shall be where I shall be. In time, of course, the claim is that God, Yahweh, appears on another mountain, Zion. From Zion, perfect in beauty, says Isaiah, God shone forth. The one of Sinai is now known as the one who dwells on Mount Zion. God is no longer a wandering deity pitching his tent in the wilderness, says Levinson, but God is enthroned on Mount Sinai, a pledge of divine support for a human dynasty, the Davidic dynasty. And from this point onward, the image of Zion is entangled with power politics. And archaeology, as we talked about last week, has been employed to establish claims to the land and claims to Mount Zion in particular. As I said, as far as can be determined, Mount Zion is a rather unremarkable hill on the east side of the old city of Jerusalem, perched where the Kidron Valley meets up with the Tyropean Valley. It's a very inconspicuous spot, actually, but it's now being vigorously excavated in search of evidence that would connect that site with the Jebusite stronghold that David conquered and to which he brought the Ark of the Covenant, which he then made into his capital and on which David's son Solomon built the temple. To date, there's no compelling evidence that's been found to connect that site, Mount Zion, to an ancient ruler, David. All that's been accomplished by that archaeological excavation is an assault on a Palestinian neighborhood, Silwan, the destabilization of foundations of homes, the seizure of homes, the harassment of residents in the hope they'll leave. Levinson is clear. Jewish tradition canonized Sinai, not Zion. There has never arisen another prophet like Moses, says the book of Deuteronomy, whom Yahweh knew face to face. The concept of Torah, which is foundational to Judaism, is the books of Moses and speaks of the people's experience as they move from Mount Zion through the wilderness to the promised land. Sinai is not absorbed in the Zion. And at its best, these two traditions of Sinai and Zion, Levinson says, are ideally, at its best, mutual correction. But ironically, although Zionism got traction because of virulent anti-Semitism in the late 19th century in Europe, early Zionists turned their backs on Torah and Talmudic study and traditional Jewish communities to adopt a new identity as secular modern Jews. And yet, and these are all the contradictions woven in, from very early on, Jewish Zionism was dressed in biblical imagery. Though the leaders were themselves secular Jews who had embraced European Enlightenment ideals, they grasped the strategic advantage of weaving their settler project to settle Palestine, with the biblical stories of conquest and the settlement of the land found in Torah. David Ben-Gurion, who was the first president of the state of Israel, said after he visited to a group who were visiting Palestine in 1937, "The Bible is our mandate." Ben-Gurion was a secular Jew. He was clear about that. He was also clear the Bible was the Jews' title deed to Palestine, with a genealogy of 3,500 years. The message of the chosen people makes sense in secular, nationalist, and historical terms, he wrote, even though I reject theology. The single most important book in my life is the Bible. From the beginning, then, as you might imagine, there were significant differences and disagreements among those who held Zionist aspirations. There were indeed, from the beginning, what one might call Jewish Zionism. There was socialist or labor Zionism. The lovers of Zion, they were called. In the 1880s, they formed a society of farmers and artisans who wanted to settle the land of Palestine, saying, "Jews, we've been completely cut off from nature, imprisoned in city walls for 2,000 years. We lack the habit of labor. Labor will bind us to the soil and to our national culture. The land of Israel will be acquired through labor, not through blood." So there was socialist labor Zionism. keen to farm the land. There was cultural Zionism, which imagined Jews would ingather in Palestine and be a spiritual center that would radiate spiritual energy to the world of the Jewish diaspora. And these cultural Zionists warned that they dare not disrespect the people already living in the land. The form of Zionism that prevailed is referred to as political Zionism. This is the form of Zionism that Theodor Herzl put forward. This is the form of Zionism that was part of this wave of European ethnic nationalist movements drawing on the Bible as history, and this claim of continuity for its project of settlement from Abraham, the first Zionist, onward. And of course, as we talked about last week, the book of Joshua provided muscular, militaristic images of the conquest of the land and the extermination of the people. And some symbols of traditional Judaism were also carefully chosen to confirm a common heritage, even as they were modernized and secularized. For example, biblical Hebrew was taken as the basis for what is now modern Hebrew. At the First World Zionist Congress in 1897, the goal was clearly stated: to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine. The use of the word home instead of state was deliberate and deliberately misreading, because after the Congress, 2 rabbis were sent to Palestine, like those spies were sent by Joshua into the land. So 2 rabbis were sent from the Congress to Palestine to survey the land and report back about settlement options and opportunities. Their response is by now infamous. The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. In other words, from the beginning, the Zionists knew there were people living in the land. This was not a land without a people, for a people without a land. Virtually all the arable land was under cultivation. That was 1897. A key turning point in the Zionist project was World War I. During the war, for military reasons, for militarily expedient reasons, the British made promises to the Arab peoples to support their fulfillment of their nationalistic aspirations. But before the end of the war, those promises were betrayed by the 1917 Balfour Declaration of Support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This confirmed the goal of the leaders of the Zionist movement, the goal they had had from the beginning, the establishment of an exclusively Jewish state, Eretz Israel, that would include, and do not miss this, Jordan, what is today parts of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, the West Bank and Gaza, and what is present-day Israel. By the 1920s, a particularly strident form of political Zionism had gained power. They were known as revisionists. Their stated objective was to establish a militarized nation state on both banks of the Jordan River. They cited the conquest of Joshua. They also cited the conquest of the Spanish in Mexico and Peru. And one of their leaders declared, Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. The colonization can therefore continue and develop only under the protection of a force, an iron wall, which the native population cannot break through. That this, the leader said, is our policy toward the Arabs. To formulate it in any other way would be hypocrisy. Still, it was clear post-World War I that to the Zionist leaders that they needed the support and sponsorship of one or another European powers. And for them, that was the British. The British sponsorship was clear, along with funds from France. During the 1920s and the 1930s, Jewish Zionist leaders pursued one clear goal: construction of infrastructure for a Jewish state in Palestine. The Jewish Agency was the organizing center. The Jewish National Fund was the resource center. And what drove this development of infrastructure was a doctrine of separation. There were to be separate trade unions, Jewish and Arab. There were to be separate educational systems. There was to be separate governance. There had been earlier cooperation among Jews and Muslims and Christians. Any cooperation was opposed and destroyed by Zionist leadership, wrote Jewish historian Ilan Pappé. The aim was separation, ideologically and practically. This doctrine of separation is made clear in a book that I just ran across recently. It's a book that was written in 1924 called You Gentile by Maurice Samuel. He was a leader of the Zionist Organization of America and a lifelong friend of Chaim Weizmann, who was the future first president of the State of Israel. Samuel's thesis is put forth in the first chapter. Wherever the Jew is found, he's a problem, a source of unhappiness to himself and those around him. Ever since he's been scattered in your midst, you Gentiles, he has had to maintain a continuous struggle for the conservation of his identity. The root of the problem is that in this Western world, there are essentially two people with two spiritual forces, Jew and Gentile. We Jews stand apart from you Gentiles in a primal duality that breaks the humanity I know into two distinct parts. This duality is fundamental, and all differences among you Gentiles are trivialities compared to that which divide all of you from all of us. This division of humanity into Jew and Gentile, or as it was also put, not Jew and not Jew, is the key to understanding how Palestinians living in the land could simply be disregarded. Indeed, their presence denied. We all know of, we've maybe heard Golda Meir saying there are no Palestinians. It was simply the denial of their existence. They are not Jew. And this doctrine of separation had one of two logical outcomes. either genocide or the transfer of the Palestinian population out of the land. And from the mid-1920s until the late 1930s, Zionist leaders designed and promoted transfer plans and proposals. This notion of transfer, and that is the word that was used, transfer of the population, was not an add-on. It was integral to the political Zionist vision. The earliest documented statement of this goal was documented in 1926. From the beginning, the intention to redeem the land, to establish a Jewish state, meant the transfer of those already living there. The earliest settlers back in the 1880s, these lovers of Zion, put it a bit more gently, but clearly. They said it's very simple. We'll harass them until they get them, and until they get out. Let them go to Transjordan. So for the Jewish Zionists, the early Jewish Zionist leaders, Palestinians were not a nation. They were part of a larger Arab nation. Theodor Herzl, early in the 1890s, spoke about his hope to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. Expropriation and the removal must be carried out discreetly, circumspectly. Ben-Gurion in the mid-30s, we must expel the Arabs and take their place. And in 1940, a senior member of the Jewish National Fund chaired a transfer committee, and he wrote, "The only solution is a land of Israel devoid of Arabs. There is no room here for compromise. They must all be moved. Not one village, not one tribe can remain. Only through this transfer of the Arabs living in the land of Israel will redemption come." 2 points. One, I cite these quotations not to demonstrate individual Zionist leaders' claims, but to make clear that senior leaders of the Zionist movement were unanimous. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine was a priority. This included not only expulsion, but the destruction of homes and villages, the theft of property, and the resettlement of these villages and lands with Jewish immigrants. The doctrine of separation and its logical outcome, transfer or ethnic cleansing, or extermination and genocide. Neither this ideology nor this strategy has changed in the slightest. Jewish settlers still today violently harass Palestinians living in the West Bank and in Gaza, hoping they'll get out, hoping to drive them from their homes and land. And it's still said today, let them go to Jordan, let them go to Egypt. This continued after the miracle of the 1967 war, when Israel seized more land, that is the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Golan Heights. Thousands who had fled the hostilities were not allowed to return. Any resident not present when the post-war census was taken also lost the right of residency. Overnight, the population of the now occupied territories declined by 20%. In the wake of the 1967 war, another form of Jewish Zionism appeared, religious Zionism. And this is the heart of the settler movement in the West Bank still today, rallying around the redemption of the land with a messianic zeal. They focus on settling sites taken to be biblical sites. They began in the midst of the old city of Hebron in 1968. And their redemption ideology has been sweetened by the government, incentives such as cheap housing and other subsidies, all of which, of course, have entailed the confiscation of Palestinian land. The most recent figures I have found is an estimate that the land confiscated in the West Bank is now more than 80%. And of course, this includes what is now called Greater Jerusalem, which has been created by a ring of Jewish settlements all around it. And Israel has continued to use all sorts of methods to reduce the Palestinian population, permit administrative deportation, encouraging voluntary immigration by making living conditions so impossible. This doctrine of separation, with its logical outcomes, is what Jimmy Carter called apartheid in his 2007 book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. The critical question, Carter said, who has the right to live there? Israel's basic law defines the country as a state of the Jewish people. The law accords the right of return to any Jewish person living anywhere in the world at any time. At the same time, Israel denies the right of return to millions of Palestinians driven out of their homeland in 1948, 47, and on, with their descendants still living in refugee camps unto the 5th and 6th generations. Their homes, farms, orchards, shops, libraries, and on were seized without compensation. All of this despite numerous UN resolutions upholding the right of return. I mentioned Israel's basic laws that define the country as a state of the Jewish people. There are a number of basic laws, but it's important to note that I noted last week that Israel has never established its official boundaries as a state. Neither has Israel, after 76 years, ratified a constitution. Why? To draft and to ratify a constitution, there would have to be a clarity about the question of equal rights for all citizens. This would include coming to terms with a basic contradiction. Israel as a state for the Jewish people and Israel's claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East. And Israel would have to settle the most vexing question: who is a Jew? Contradictions. They're there in Christian Zionism, as we talked last week. On one hand, there is a Judeo-philia, an affirmation of the Jews as God's chosen people, and the support of their return to the promised land, a support for their settlement in the land. And yet, at the end of time, an anti-Semitism rears its head. Jews either convert to Christianity or be damned to hell. Contradictions also in Jewish Zionism. It is a modern secular vision of a democratic nation state, yet it also claims to be an exclusively Jewish state based on a doctrine of separation and its logical outcomes, either ethnic cleansing or genocide. which we see being played out until today. I welcome this time for questions and comments.
Can you hear us, Melanie?
Yes, I can.
I guess I don't see any hands up, so I'll ask a question. So you mentioned this concept of redemption, which was an interesting mindset, given that anti-Semitism on the part of all the rest of us kind of is at the basis of where we are now. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more on why the Zionists speak about redemption as a result of clearing all the Arabs from the land.
The redemption of the land is simply that the land is returned to the people of the land.
So it's not a
So-
redemption,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, so it's not a redemption of the people in the way that we might think of redemption of sin, but it's a
No.
redemption of the land itself.
It's a redemption of the land itself.
All right, thank you. We have a hand up. Whoever, from our guests joining us from Trinity, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. I had to be allowed to unmute and it just happened. So this is Lynn from Trinity. And my question is probably a little simplistic, Melanie, but I think for me, it's just trying to determine if I'm correct in my understanding. When I hear about the doctrine of separation, what I sort of immediately start thinking of in parallel terms, is it appropriate to think in parallel terms to the reading I've done and how I've started to try to educate myself related to how the doctrine of discovery played out, like in this country? I mean, I realize it's kind of different, but it all seems to be about taking what's not ours and power and control. Am I on the right track, or is that not correct?
Well, yes, I think you are, Lynn. It's in its most basic terms, the doctrine of separation is us and them, right? And the doctrine of discovery included this idea that that lands that are inhabited by non-Christians can be taken. And so if for the Zionists it was Jew, not Jew, for the doctrine of discovery, it was Christian, not Christian. So I think you're very much on the right track.
We have another hand up from the group with Richard Myers. Need to.
Hi there. Can
Hello.
you hear?
Hi, Beth.
Hey, Melanie, I'm a group of 7 of us over the way at Emmanuel Baptist Church tuning in today. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about this idea of separation and of groups setting themselves apart. And I'm wondering, this is not really specifically or at all about Palestine and Israel, but can you or anybody know of examples where that has been beneficial to groups rather than harmful? I mean, here in the US, we try to include people, it's in our Constitution eventually that we're all one, black and white, everybody. But so it just seems to me that this has been so harmful to Jews to want themselves to be separate.
Well, that's a really interesting question, Beth. The first thing that comes to mind is all girls schools, where we're in a class, if girls in a classroom with boys, a power differential sets in, and very often girls' self-expression is thwarted. And so there's some who argue for all girls schools, at least through secondary education, so that girls find their own voice and think their own thoughts apart from societally constructed notions of gender and dominance, subordinates, and all the rest of it. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But perhaps others have other examples or thoughts on that question.
I'm kind of thinking of like large ethnic groups, for example, Kurds or Armenians in history. And I don't know that much history to think about whether that has been harmful or helpful to groups like that, large ethnic groups rather than biological groups, I guess.
Yeah. I'm hard pressed to think of, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of multi-ethnic empires where there would have been ethnic enclaves, but still interaction. Or I'm even thinking of, you know, in the pre-1880 Palestine, there were certainly areas, for example, Tiberias was, or Safad, these were Jewish neighborhoods or villages. But with interaction, they weren't isolated. They interacted and engaged with their neighbors. There wasn't this sense of exclusivism attached to an identity that I think set in the latter part of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, thanks for mentioning that. It kind of brings to mind this idea of saying one group or like Jews, non-Jews, blacks, not black, that kind of thing. And
exactly.
how isn't helpful.
Yeah, and in the earliest, in some of the earliest Zionist literature, the word Arab doesn't show up. It's simply non-Jews. And in the Balfour Declaration, that's the language that's used. So it's Jews and not Jews. And then only later is the identification Arab. And at no point is the identification Palestinian, not even today. You can very quickly tell somebody's political perspective if they use the word Palestinian, because to use that word was to acknowledge a national identity, that is the identity of a people. And if you remember what we talked about last week, to be a nation is to be a nation state. To use the word Palestinian would be to recognize Palestinian nationalist aspirations. So the people already living in the land are Arab. They belong to a larger Arab nation. They could go live with other Arab people.
We have a question from Deborah.
Hi, yeah, Beth, I was listening to your question, and I just wonder, because I remember in South Africa when we were moving towards a democratically elected government and an equal dismantlement of apartheid, the issue of homelands came in. Could we have an Afrikaans homeland? Could we have a different sort of cultural or racial group homeland? And I remember South Africa having a lot of discussion around that, and they decided not to allow any national homeland kind of ideology to root in our nation. The reason being because they were saying, the minute you create a land that is for a separate racial or religious grouping, invariably the question is what's going to happen to the other people who live in that area who are not of that demographic. So, are you going to ask them to leave? Are you going to make life unpleasant for them? And then, of course, the other issue that immediately comes in is well, what about laws in terms of equality? Because invariably you end up with the majority having rights that the minority doesn't. So, it was just when you asked that question, it got me thinking back to South Africa and all the debates, in 1994 and just prior to that around, how best to structure society and what does separate mean, legally and in terms of actual demographics. Thanks.
Thanks, Debs. Oops.
We have another
Hi,
question.
can you hear?
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you so much. My knowledge is so limited, but I just had a question about our own government. And what do you think is going through the mind of our president and leaders? I don't understand why they're supporting. I mean, I don't understand. I have a naive interpretation of our president. I thought he was a compassionate man, and I don't get it. Is there political forces that power that are at play here that are causing him to support Israel? Or I don't know, maybe there's something behind the scenes that people don't know about.
It's a very important question. Thank you. I would say there are two dynamics. One, we can't forget that at least some of the Europeans who settled the Americas were Puritans who understood themselves to be the new Israel. They were settling the new Israel, a city on a hill, Jerusalem. The native peoples, the Amalekites, wiped them out, and the steady march across the continent, which is to say, to challenge the state of Israel is to challenge ourselves. To be critical of the state of Israel and its settler colonial project is to we have to then be self-critical. And not many people are open to that. We hear so much these days about what history can and can't be taught, making our children uncomfortable about what we teach. But there's another, that's sort of one dynamic that I think is very real and at play. But there's another dynamic. Remember, I said the Zionist leaders figured out very quickly that they needed the support and sponsorship of other power, European power or European style power to support them. And so there's a way in which Israel has always been a kind of client state of the West in the Middle East. And especially from the 1967 war. Before the 1967 war, the US wasn't so sure how to relate to Israel, honestly. But with the 1967 war, it was clear to the US that Israel could be a strategic and effective partner in the Middle East at a time when Arab nationalism and Arab liberation struggles were on the rise and threatening US access to a very crucial resource, oil. So from that time, Israel has been the Western nationalist, it's a secular modern state. It's been, and this is part of the rhetoric of it's the only democracy in the Middle East. So it is the Western nation state, the democracy, looking after US and other Western interests in the whole region. And that's what makes it ironclad. And as our president said, and that's why we send to Israel more aid than we send to any other country or all other countries combined. That's why we make available to Israel high technology weaponry that we make available to no one else. Israel is our key strategic partner in the region.
Thank you so much.
And yet, we are just getting notifications that after the Iran strike on Israeli land people, President Biden has just told Netanyahu that we will not support Israel in a counterstrike. So it does seem as though we are beginning to butt up against whatever that red line is in this moment.
This, I think we're seeing the most questioning that we have seen, and it is in large part, there has been an outpouring of protest in this country. And Biden is feeling the political heat. It's very significant. The protests, the thousands who have turned out, it's very significant when in primaries, none of the above is the vote cast. So we are seeing Biden towing a line he otherwise would not have towed. And yet, don't miss, when Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, we heard very little. In fact, I heard some commentators sort of softly justifying why Israel might have felt the need to do that. Not the hue and cry when Iran sends drones Israel's way. But you're right. We're hearing I think a stronger voice of protest and question than we've heard in a long time.
How much of that do you ascribe to the fact that the Jewish state has now been around for 75 years? And I served on Long Island for 11.5 years. So in an area of the country where there is an enormous Jewish population, my daughter's best friend is Jewish. She's in her late 20s. We've had conversations about the war, and she's utterly opposed to it as a young Jewish woman, and is utterly opposed to what's happening to the people of Gaza. And so how much do you ascribe to that being this, Israel has been around long enough now that it is in many, particularly young people's minds, accepted as a state in a way that I think perhaps people who were around when it was first, coming into being felt like they had to fight for it, for us. And now I don't think there's a whole lot, at least in young people's minds, idea that it could be taken away. Do you think that has any bearing in why there's also willing to be more pushback on how it operates?
I think that's a very good comment, Rebecca. I think that's a very insightful comment. I do think, no, just to say, I think you're really right, Rebecca. I think there's a there-ness about the state of Israel that a younger generation is not willing to exempt it from its accountability among the nations of the world. In a way that it has been exempted and been able to act with impunity for most of its history.
I am also aware that we are 5 minutes past our allotted time, and you have once again just brought us through such an insightful and meaningful time. Thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to 2 weeks from today, not next week, but on the 28th, having our final gathering on this topic. And I'd just like to thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights.
Thank you all so much. And I really want to invite you to bring your questions because I especially want us to delve more deeply into what is happening in Gaza and why and where to and so on. So please, I'm going to say less so that we can together say more in that search for understanding. Thank you all so much.
Bring up one more thing before you go. My daughter was with us last week and was very grateful for the context that you brought to us. But she is a journalist in Washington, D.C. And so she did make the comment to me that the Washington Post actually has journalists on site in Gaza, and their primary reporter is a Palestinian who is a friend of hers. So just to be aware that there is at least one place in our national, she said, yes, the networks are garbage, don't listen to them. But she did the Post as having some on the ground Palestinian resourced and voiced commentary.
That's
And
really wonderful. And I pray for the safety of that journalist.
Yeah.
My niece is in Jerusalem, she's 20, and she was just leaving out of there when the drones came and went into a bunker. I think she lives outside Jerusalem, but I know we don't have time, but maybe in 2 weeks we could talk about that a little bit more and find out what. I know you can't tell me what's gonna happen in the future, but whatever you can tell us about that, I would appreciate it.
Good. Thank you. Thank you all.